Judge Carlos Martinez straightened his robes as he entered courtroom 8A of the Los Angeles Superior Court. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. At 58, Martinez carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades on the bench, though lately that confidence had hardened into something closer to arrogance. His clerk, Thomas, hurried forward with the day's docket, already sorted according to Martinez's precise preferences. 23 cases today, Your Honor, Thomas whispered, including 3 property disputes and a handful of minor infractions. Martinez nodded curtly, barely acknowledging the young man's presence. The first few cases proceeded as usual. Martinez handed down his decisions with mechanical efficiency, barely listening to the defendant's explanations. His reputation for being tough but fair had earned him respect among his peers, though whispers about his harsher sentences for certain groups occasionally circulated through the courthouse halls. At 10:30, case number 47B was called. Grace Park approached the podium, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She wore a charcoal gray suit that spoke of quiet elegance, her long black hair swept into a neat chignon. Despite her professional appearance, Martinez barely glanced up from his papers. Another parking dispute, he muttered, more to himself than the court. The charge seemed simple enough. Park's car had been photographed in a restricted zone near the federal building. What should have been a straightforward fine had escalated when she had attempted to contest the ticket. Thomas noticed something unusual about the case file and tried to catch Martinez's attention, but the judge was already speaking. Ms. He paused, deliberately mispronouncing her surname, Park. You're contesting a clearly documented infraction. Your vehicle was photographed in a restricted area. Grace Park stood perfectly straight, her hands clasped before her. Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances, I was actually attending a... Martinez cut her off with a wave of his hand. The circumstances are clear in the citation. Your vehicle was parked in a federal security zone for over 2 hours. He shuffled the papers, missing the subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere as several attorneys in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. What Martinez also failed to notice was the way his clerk kept trying to slide an additional document onto his desk, or how the court reporter had suddenly sat up straighter, her fingers hovering above her stenotype machine with unusual tension. Grace Park tried once more. Your Honor, I have documentation showing that I was. Ms. Park, Martinez interrupted again, his tone dripping with condescension. This court's time is valuable. The evidence is photographic. Unless you have a federal permit, which I see no record of in this file, your presence in that zone was unauthorized. A small smile played at the corners of Grace's lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. She remained silent now, watching as Martinez launched into what the regular courtroom attendees recognized as his familiar lecture about respect for the law. The morning light had shifted, casting Martinez's face in harsh relief as he pronounced his decision. A fine 3 times the standard amount, plus mandatory attendance at a traffic safety course. He delivered the sentence with an air of finality, already reaching for the next case file. Grace Park bowed slightly, accepting the ruling with unexpected grace. As she turned to leave, she made eye contact with Thomas, who looked mortified. She gave him a reassuring nod, collected her belongings, and walked out of the courtroom with perfect composure. Martinez was already calling the next case, completely unaware that he had just set in motion events that would shape the very foundation of his judicial career. The afternoon session began with Judge Martinez growing increasingly irritated at the mounting stack of cases. The incident with Grace Park had left him with an inexplicable unease, though he pushed the feeling aside. His clerk, Thomas, had been acting strangely since that morning, fumbling with files and casting nervous glances toward the door. Your Honor, Thomas approached tentatively during a brief recess about Ms. Park's case earlier. Martinez waved him off. Already handled, Thomas. Next case. He adjusted his reading glasses, missing the look of resignation on his clerk's face. In the courthouse hallway, Grace Park sat on a polished wooden bench, typing rapidly on her phone. Several veteran lawyers who passed by did double takes, some attempting to catch her eye. She acknowledged them with subtle nods but continued her work. A young public defender, Maria Suarez, recognized Grace and nearly dropped her briefcase. "Justice P," she began, but Grace quickly raised a finger to her lips, smiling warmly. "Just Grace today," she whispered, patting the bench beside her. "I'm handling a personal matter." She showed Maria her phone screen, displaying the freshly issued court order for Martinez. The public defender's eyes widened as she read the excessive fine. "But this is ridiculous. When the Bar Association finds out." Grace gently touched Maria's arm. "Everything happens for a reason," she said softly. "Sometimes people need to see their reflection clearly before they can change." Back in the courtroom, Martinez was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Something about Park's quiet dignity had gotten under his skin. Most defendants either cowered or became belligerent when he handed down harsh sentences. Her composure felt like a challenge. During the next case, he found himself distracted by a conversation he'd had years ago with his mentor, James Park. They discussed the importance of seeing the person behind the case file, of understanding cultural contexts. He pushed the memory away, focusing instead on maintaining his reputation for swift, decisive justice. Thomas appeared again, this time with a newspaper clipping. "Your Honor, I really think you should." "Thomas," Martinez snapped, "unless the building is on fire, it can wait." The young clerk retreated, shoulders slumped, tucking the article back into his pocket. It featured a prominent photo of Grace Park being sworn in as the newest California Supreme Court Justice. In the courthouse cafeteria, whispers circulated about the morning's events. A security guard who had witnessed the proceedings was recounting the story to a captivated audience of courthouse staff. "Never seen anything like it," he said, shaking his head. Judge Martinez didn't even look at her bar credentials. Just treated her like. He trailed off, noticing Grace Park herself entering the cafeteria. The room fell silent as she purchased a coffee, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Several people tried to approach her, but she politely declined conversation. As she left, she paused by the security guard's table. "Sometimes," she said quietly, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." She smiled warmly at the group and departed, leaving a wake of murmured conversations. Back in his chambers, Martinez was reviewing his afternoon docket when a gilded invitation caught his eye. The annual California Judicial Excellence Awards were being held that evening at the Biltmore Hotel. He had almost forgotten about the mandatory event, having skipped it the previous 2 years. As he slipped the invitation into his briefcase, he had no idea that in just a few hours, his entire world would be turned upside down. The Biltmore Hotel's crystal ballroom sparkled under the grand chandeliers, its gilded walls reflecting the soft lighting that bathed the gathering of California's most distinguished legal minds. Judge Carlos Martinez adjusted his bow tie for the third time, feeling unusually self-conscious among his peers. Several judges he normally socialized with seemed to be avoiding eye contact. Chief Justice Rodriguez, who usually greeted him warmly, merely nodded before turning back to her conversation. Martinez attributed it to typical political maneuvering, though a nagging feeling persisted in the back of his mind. "Quite a morning you had," remarked Justice Thompson, appearing suddenly at Martinez's elbow. There was something in his tone that made Martinez pause mid-sip of his champagne. Before he could respond, Thompson had already drifted away, leaving Martinez to wonder about the cryptic comment. The evening's program began with the usual formalities: acknowledgments of retired judges, celebrations of milestone careers, and polite applause for various achievements. Martinez found himself checking his watch repeatedly, already planning his early exit. "And now," announced Chief Justice Rodriguez, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "we come to the evening's highlight, the introduction of our newest appointment to the California Supreme Court." Martinez reached for another glass of champagne, only half listening. He had skipped the recent investiture ceremony, claiming a full docket. The room's lighting dimmed slightly as a spotlight illuminated the stage. "Her credentials are extraordinary," Rodriguez continued. Stanford Law Review editor, youngest partner at Kingston and Associates, and architect of the landmark Chen voting rights case. Something about those achievements tickled at Martinez's memory, but he dismissed it, taking another sip of champagne. More importantly, she represents the changing face of our judiciary, bringing fresh perspectives while honoring our most sacred legal traditions. The crowd's anticipation was palpable. Martinez noticed his clerk Thomas standing near the back of the room, watching him with an odd expression. Please welcome our newest and youngest California Supreme Court Justice. Martinez's glass slipped from his fingers, the crash thankfully muffled by the thick carpet as Grace Park emerged into the spotlight. She wore a midnight blue evening gown, her bearing every bit as composed as it had been in his courtroom that morning. The room erupted in applause, but Martinez barely heard it over the rushing in his ears. His mind raced back through the morning's proceedings, his dismissive tone, the interrupted explanations, the excessive fine. Each memory now felt like a physical blow. Grace Park began her address, her voice clear and measured. Justice, she said, is not just about applying the law. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before us. Martinez found himself backing away from the crowd, bumping into other guests. A few people shot him knowing looks. He caught fragments of whispered conversations. Can't believe he didn't recognize her father's protege. What was he thinking? He finally reached the relative safety of a corner, where he found himself face to face with a large photograph on the wall. James Park, his mentor, standing with a young Grace at her law school graduation. The same Grace he had treated so dismissively just hours ago. As Justice Park concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Martinez realized with growing horror that this was only the beginning of his evening. The photograph of James Park seemed to stare directly at him, his mentor's eyes holding the same quiet dignity he had seen in Grace's that morning. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force, and for the first time in years, Judge Carlos Martinez found himself completely, utterly speechless. The announcer's voice echoed through the crystal ballroom as Justice Grace Park concluded her speech. Martinez found himself unable to move from his corner, his usual confidence shattered. The room buzzed with energy as Park descended from the podium, gracefully accepting congratulations from her colleagues. She clerked for the Supreme Court, a voice said nearby. Youngest clerk in 20 years. Martinez recognized the speaker as Judge Chen from the appellate court. Quite a morning you gave her, Chen added pointedly before disappearing into the crowd. Martinez watched as Park navigated the room with natural ease. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it, a skill he realized he had lost somewhere along his journey. Each handshake, each warm greeting she offered reminded him of her father, James Park, and the lessons he had apparently forgotten. A memory surfaced. James Park standing in Martinez's office 20 years ago, placing a hand on his shoulder. Carlos, he had said, remember that every person who enters your courtroom carries their whole life story with them. Listen before you judge. Martinez had nodded then, young and idealistic. When had he stopped listening? The crowd parted, and suddenly Grace Park was walking directly toward him. Martinez felt his collar tighten as she approached, her expression unreadable. The nearby conversations hushed, everyone aware of the morning's events. Judge Martinez, she said, her voice carrying the same composure it had in his courtroom. I believe we have some unfinished business from this morning. She gestured to a quiet corner of the ballroom. Martinez followed, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. They reached a small seating area, partially screened by ornate plants. Park sat down, smoothing her gown with practiced grace. She began, my father often spoke of you. Martinez felt his face flush. Justice Park, I. She held up a hand, silencing him just as he had silenced her that morning. The irony wasn't lost on him. He told me about a passionate young lawyer who believed in justice above all else, who fought for fair hearings regardless of who stood before him. Each word felt like a carefully placed arrow. Martinez found himself staring at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. What happened to that lawyer, Judge Martinez? Before he could respond, Thomas appeared with a folder, the same one he had tried to show Martinez earlier. Grace accepted it with a small nod. Your Honor, I took the liberty of compiling some statistics from your recent cases. She opened the folder, revealing meticulously organized charts and data. Martinez's eyes scanned the numbers, and his stomach churned. The patterns were undeniable: significantly harsher sentences based on surnames, systematically higher fines for certain groups. His bias lay bare in cold, hard data. My father, Grace continued, her voice softening slightly, always said that true strength lies not in wielding power, but in acknowledging our mistakes and learning from them. The ballroom's chandelier light caught the gold trim of her robe pin, the same design James Park had worn throughout his career. Martinez remembered the day James had given him his first judicial robe, the pride in his mentor's eyes, the weight of responsibility. Justice Park, he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. She stood smoothing her gown once more. You don't need to say anything tonight, Judge Martinez. But tomorrow, when you put on those robes, remember why you first chose to wear them. With that, she turned and walked back to the main gathering, leaving Martinez alone with the folder, his thoughts, and the ghost of the idealistic young lawyer he used to be. Back in his chambers the next morning, Judge Martinez sat motionless behind his desk, staring at the morning's docket without seeing it. The events of the previous evening played on repeat in his mind, each recollection bringing fresh waves of shame. A framed photo on his bookshelf caught his attention, himself and James Park at his judicial investiture ceremony 15 years ago. Young Martinez beamed with pride while Park's hand rested on his shoulder. He stood up, taking the photo in his trembling hands. Your first case, James had said that day, set the tone for your entire career. Make it count. Martinez had taken those words to heart, delivering a compassionate ruling in a case involving a homeless veteran. When had that compassion calcified into prejudice? His computer screen flickered with unread emails. One subject line made his heart skip. Yesterday's traffic hearing. Justice Grace Park. His finger hovered over the mouse, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. Instead, he pulled out the folder Grace had given him the previous night. The statistics were even more damning in the morning light. Page after page showed a clear pattern. Defendants with Asian or Latino surnames received fines averaging 40% higher than others for identical offenses. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Thomas entered, carrying coffee and looking uncertain. Your Honor, I've pulled the case files you requested, all decisions from the past 5 years. The boxes Thomas brought in told their own story. Martinez randomly selected files, spreading them across his desk. Each one revealed the same pattern he'd seen in Grace's data. His prejudices had been so ingrained he hadn't even noticed them. His phone buzzed, a text from James Park himself. Lunch today? The usual place. Martinez's stomach tightened. Of course, Grace would have told her father about yesterday's incident. The morning sun crept across his desk, illuminating an old legal pad. His own handwriting from years ago caught his eye. Justice is blind, but judges must see clearly. He'd written that during his first year on the bench, inspired by one of James' lectures. Martinez opened his laptop and began typing. 2. All court staff. Subject: immediate changes to processing procedures. Effective immediately, all case files will be presented with defendant names redacted during initial review. Full information to be revealed only after preliminary decisions are documented. He paused, then continued typing, his fingers moving faster as years of accumulated bias began to crack. Additionally, I am requesting a complete audit of my previous rulings to be conducted by an independent committee. Another knock. Chief Justice Rodriguez stood in his doorway. Carlos, she said gently, the Bar Association is convening an emergency session this afternoon. They're expecting you. Martinez nodded, his throat tight. Regina, he said, using her first name for the first time in years. How long have you known about my patterns? She stepped into his office, closing the door. A while. But sometimes people need to see their own reflection clearly before they can change. The same words Grace had used yesterday. Martinez looked again at the photo of his investiture. James Park's proud smile now seemed tinged with hope rather than approval. Hope that his protege would live up to the principles he taught him. His computer chimed. Grace's email still waited, unread. Outside his window, he could see the courthouse steps where just yesterday he thought he knew exactly who he was and what justice meant. Now, those certainties lay shattered at his feet. With a deep breath, he clicked to open Grace's email, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him, knowing this was just the beginning of a long journey back to the judge he had once promised to be. The Bar Association hearing room felt smaller than Martinez remembered. He sat alone at the respondents' table, his usually pristine robes feeling heavy on his shoulders. Before him lay the morning's newspaper, its headline stark and unforgiving. Supreme Court Justice exposes judicial bias in traffic court incident. Through the tall windows, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the room. Martinez found himself focusing on these shadows rather than the faces of his peers seated in judgment. The committee members shuffled papers, their whispers echoing in the cavernous space. His own case files surrounded him, hundreds of them, each representing a life he had judged too quickly, too harshly. He had spent the entire night reviewing them, each page revealing patterns he could no longer unsee. Judge Carlos Martinez, Chief Justice Rodriguez began, her voice carrying both authority and a hint of sadness. You submitted a comprehensive report of your own cases for review. Would you like to address the committee? Martinez stood slowly, his prepared statement forgotten. Instead, he pulled out a single case file. His first case as a judge, the homeless veteran. 15 years ago, he began, his voice surprisingly steady. I believe justice meant seeing the person behind the case number. He opened another file from last week. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I started seeing categories, assumptions, prejudices. His voice cracked slightly. I became what I once fought against. The room remained silent as he continued through case after case, laying bare his transformation from idealistic young judge to what he had become. Some committee members took notes, others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. I am not here to defend my actions, he said, closing the last file. I am here to acknowledge them, to take responsibility for them, and to begin the work of making them right. Justice Park's father, James, sat in the back row. Their eyes met briefly, and Martinez saw not condemnation but the same patient wisdom that had guided him years ago. The committee asked questions for hours. Martinez answered each one honestly, no longer attempting to justify or minimize his actions. When they asked about specific cases, he provided context while acknowledging his bias. When they questioned his ability to continue serving, he admitted his own doubts. As the sun began to set, casting the room in amber light, Chief Justice Rodriguez called for a brief recess. Martinez remained at his tables, staring at his reflection in the polished wood surface. A hand touched his shoulder. Thomas, his clerk, had stayed through the entire proceeding. Your Honor, he said quietly, there's something you should see. He handed Martinez a stack of letters. They were from defendants who had appeared in his courtroom over the years, some expressing hurt, others anger, but surprisingly, many offering hope for change. The last letter was from Grace Park herself. Dear Judge Martinez, it began, my father always taught me that true justice requires courage, not just to stand firm, but to acknowledge when we've lost our way. Your willingness to confront your own bias shows that the judge who once inspired others still exists. Martinez carefully folded the letter as the committee members filed back in. Chief Justice Rodriguez took her seat, her expression solemn but not unkind. Judge Martinez, she began, this committee has reached a decision. He stood, ready to accept whatever came next, knowing that regardless of their ruling, his real work, the work of rebuilding trust and rediscovering his humanity, was just beginning. The shadows had lengthened across the room, but for the first time in years, Martinez felt like he could finally see clearly. 1 week after the Bar Association hearing, Justice Grace Park sat in her private chambers reviewing Martinez's case. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space she had only recently made her own. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, knowing exactly who it would be. Judge Martinez entered, looking notably different from the man who had presided over her traffic case. His shoulders carried a different weight now, not of authority, but of understanding. "Justice Park," he began, but she gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit, and call me Grace. We're past formalities now." She pulled out a thick folder, different from the one she had presented at the awards ceremony. "I've been reviewing your recent proposals for judicial reform." Martinez nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The Bar Association had allowed him to retain his position, but with strict conditions. His response had been to propose sweeping changes that went far beyond their requirements. Blind initial case reviews, Grace read from his proposal. Mandatory bias training, monthly audit of sentencing patterns. She looked up, studying his face. "These go well beyond what the committee demanded." "They're what's necessary," Martinez replied simply. "What I should have been doing all along." Grace stood and walked to her window, looking out over the Los Angeles skyline. "My father used to tell me about a young lawyer who once argued that justice shouldn't just be blind. It should be insightful. That understanding human nature was as important as understanding law." Martinez remembered making that argument decades ago in James Park's office. "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." "No," Grace turned back to him. "You buried it." But it never left. She returned to her desk and pressed a button on her phone. "Send them in, please." The door opened, and 3 people entered. Defendants from Martinez's past cases, each carrying stories of how his biased rulings had affected their lives. But instead of anger, they brought proposals for change. Maria Chen, a small business owner he had fined excessively 5 years ago, now headed a community advisory board for judicial accountability. James Rodriguez, whose minor traffic violation had spiraled into a financial crisis under Martinez's harsh ruling, had become an advocate for court reform. "These people," Grace said softly, "believe in the possibility of change. They've agreed to work with you on implementing your reforms." Martinez looked at each face, really seeing them for the first time. He recognized in their expressions the same hope he had once carried as a young judge. "We're not here to punish you, Judge Martinez," Grace continued. "We're here to help rebuild. My father always said that true redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about transforming it into wisdom for the future." She handed him a new folder. "The Supreme Court has approved your proposals with one addition." She smiled. "We'd like you to lead the implementation team. Work with these community members. Show other judges that change is possible." Martinez opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph, himself as a young lawyer, standing with James Park, both smiling at the camera. Paperclipped to it was a note in James's handwriting. "It's never too late to remember who you were meant to be." "Well, Judge Martinez?" Grace asked, her voice carrying the same quiet strength it had in his courtroom that fateful day. "Are you ready to begin?" Martinez looked at the faces around him. Grace, the community members, his own younger self in the photograph, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm ready." 1 year later, Judge Martinez stood at the podium in the same crystal ballroom where his transformation had begun. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and community members, all gathered for the first annual Judicial Accountability and Community Trust Summit. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room, "I stood in this very space as a man who had lost his way." He paused, looking out at the familiar faces. "Today, I stand here as proof that change isn't just possible, it's essential." In the front row, Justice Grace Park sat beside her father, James. Both nodded encouragingly as Martinez continued his address. The past year had been a journey of continuous learning and unlearning, of breaking down old habits and building new foundations. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told a powerful story. Since implementing the blind review system, sentencing disparities in his courtroom had dropped by 78%. Over 40 other judges had voluntarily adopted his reforms, creating ripple effects throughout the California judicial system. But numbers only tell part of the story, Martinez said, gesturing to the community advisory board members seated nearby. The real change happens in the daily moments when we choose to see each person who stands before us as exactly that, a person. Maria Chen stood up to share how the Community Oversight Program had transformed the relationship between the courts and local neighborhoods. James Rodriguez followed with data showing how the new flexible payment system for fines had reduced default rates and helped families maintain stability. From the back of the room, Thomas, now a senior clerk trainer, watched proudly. The system he had helped design for anonymous initial case reviews had been adopted by courts in 3 other states. This isn't just about one judge's awakening, Martinez continued, his voice thick with emotion. It's about building a justice system that truly serves justice, where dignity isn't earned by status or surname, but is given freely as a fundamental right. Grace Park approached the podium, standing beside him. Judge Martinez has shown us that accountability and compassion can coexist, she addressed the crowd. That admitting our mistakes doesn't diminish our authority, it strengthens it. Together, they unveiled the next phase of the program, a statewide initiative to implement bias awareness training and community engagement requirements for all judicial appointments. The proposal had already gained support from the state legislature. As the presentation concluded, James Park made his way to the stage, embracing both Martinez and his daughter. The photographer captured the moment, 3 generations of legal minds united in the cause of true justice. Later, as the evening wound down, Martinez found himself back in that same corner where he had tried to hide a year ago. But this time, he watched the room with clear eyes and an open heart. Young clerks approached him for advice, community members shared stories, and fellow judges sought guidance on implementing reforms in their own courtrooms. Grace appeared at his side, champagne glasses in hand. "You've come a long way from that traffic hearing," she smiled, offering him a glass. "We all have," he replied, thinking of how that moment of shame had transformed into a movement for change. As they looked out over the crowded ballroom, Martinez saw not just colleagues and community members, but a living testament to the possibility of transformation. The justice system was changing, one courtroom at a time, one decision at a time, one life at a time. The Los Angeles sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues through the ballroom windows, a fitting backdrop to a day that celebrated not just how far they had come, but how far they could still go. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. The evening ended with a standing ovation, not just for Martinez or the program's success, but for the enduring hope that justice, true justice, was finally finding its way home.